really nice to see you all here. Thanks very much for coming along to this 30-minute webinar all about iPad apps for learners with complex needs. And as ever, this session is going to be recorded and it will be uploaded to the Call Scotland YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So this afternoon, we're delighted to be joined by Dave Stevens and Professor Paul Blenkhorn from Sensory App House. I'm sure I wasn't alone in enjoying the lovely pulsing jellyfish that were on the screen there just as we were waiting for the webinar to start. And I'm also quite sure that if you're working in a school with learners who have complex needs, lots of their apps will already be familiar to you. I remember the Magma Lava Lamp and the Cinevox apps back when I was teaching. They were real favourites in my classroom. But today, Dave is going to show us lots of examples of their brilliant apps, and hopefully, if he has time as well, talk a wee bit about the Microsoft Adaptive Controller. So Dave, I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, and welcome everybody. Hopefully everyone can hear me, and secondly, hopefully everyone can see my screen where I've created a little web page for today that we can send around later as well. Paul, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Paul there? Everyone can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Dave.
Thank you. And Paul's going to interject, hopefully as and when frequently, to add any information that's useful. Thank you. So we'll just review Sensory App House and look at some of the newer, more popular switch accessible apps that we've done, sensory apps for learners with, or learners, as it says on here, with complex needs. Sorry for the typo there. We'll look also how we've been working on what we call web apps that allow the same app to work on every device. We've done a lot of work on that in the last couple of years. And sort of related to that, I wanted to sort of raise awareness of something we found a few years ago called the Microsoft Adaptive Controller. So I'm going to hold it up to the camera. Hopefully you can see I've got one here. We'll run a video on that and talk through that towards the end. So Paul and I have, well, Paul's worked in software and computing for disabilities for many decades. Myself, I have as well. I used to work with the Dragon naturally speaking software, and we also, Paul wrote the original Claro Read program, so we were the owners of Claro. But the last few years, we've been able to focus on the sensory apps and the development of the range of apps for stimulation, early learning, coordination, relaxation, fun, art and speech therapy, and a few other ones on the way. So we find that they're generally, the apps are generally used by therapists, educators, helpers, helping people with different complex disabilities and visual difficulties and maybe speech difficulties. Most of the apps so far have been free, or they're currently, many are still free or low cost. The first one we did was, I think the first one we did was Electra in 2013. Up until that point, all these sensory apps had been for Windows in old style, but Electra was the first one in 2013 on the iPad. And this is a video of how Electra works. It was easier for me to do a video of this one. So it was a touch effect app, interactive. It allowed for multiple touches, so two people could be using it. It's Sparky, and it's got different colors, and it's downloaded incredibly well right from the first day. We've been quite astounded. So we carried on doing some more. I mentioned Cinevox. I think there was 20 or 25 iPad apps that we created around that time, and they just carried on to download over the years, really.
I think one of the interesting things about Electra, if you can hear me, was the collaborative options, where you could have a teacher on a touch screen with the tablet between them and the child. You could have the child using their touch on the screen as well as the teacher, or switches, or two children. So the collaboration, I think, was particularly interesting in Electra. Over.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. And so, I mean, generally, this is obviously a sensory sort of stimulation, quite straightforward, simple app. No adverts in it, no logins, no requirements for in-app purchases, and so keeping it nice and simple does one thing. And so we recently expanded the range of apps, but I'll just show a few other ones that I've got open now. This one was done in about 2019 or 2020, I think, and this is something called Splatter. And I'm just going to run this in my web browser. I'll make it full screen if I can. It's not quite behaving the full screen behavior for some reason, but it doesn't matter. It's there. So with Splatter, these are 8 different scenes. This is switch controlled or it's mouse controlled. We can tap in different places, so you may well want to have some kind of mouse control or thumbstick control. It gives a nice pop, and we've got some nice backgrounds that we can change to. If my backgrounds are loading up, there we go. I'm running this effectively direct from the internet now in the Chrome browser, as you can see. And we've got different scenes. We've got some nice butterflies. We've got some shapes, some sticks, some funky sea creatures. So nice and simple to use, fully switch accessible with sound and strong graphics. And they're also keyboard accessible. So I'm just using the space bar now to bring up my alien. So that app's called Splatter. There is another similar one, which was called Touch Targets, similar in concept, Touch Targets. I'll just load up. Again, this was perhaps more coordination. So we get to choose a different character and a different scene, and we can change the size of the we can make it jump around with the switch touch. We can change the size of the background and the size of the object. I recall, yeah, that's a big one now. It's a small one, and when we can point the mouse at it, it pops away and reappears somewhere else. So again, using a joystick or some kind of eye control and some kind of switch interaction will make it jump around. And again, lots of content, divers, fish, and you can see from the top pictures that we've got, you know, robots, targets, balloons, similarly. So this again is running in the web browser. There was an app that was developed initially for iPad called Speak Up. It's a range of 4 or 5 speech therapy apps. Speak Up 2 is particularly popular. If I just go to the home screen of Speak Up 2, and this is something that we did rewrite as a web app. So again, we're looking at the web app interface, and this is 8 different options for encouraging speech or developing speech for people who are quiet or have got some difficulties with speech. And so if I make some noise, the character will get a bit bigger. Hopefully you can see that. And we've got balloons, we've got a sound gauge, we've got different gauges within that situation, within that mode. We've got a bear, I think, that gets bigger, and lots of different animals that will get bigger. And some settings, as you would expect, to set the maximum level and the minimum level, because somebody you might want to maybe modify the sound level that somebody's producing in the case of perhaps a hearing impaired situation, or you might want to sort of encourage the sound generation. Of course, it doesn't matter what anybody says, any noise will get a response. So that's Speak Up 2. And then another quick look at a switch app called Build It, which is a new app. Quite a lot of content in here. This is a switch operated app. If we look at the babies, we get a baby, we press the switch and something will happen. Hopefully you heard some audio of a baby laughing. I did in my ears.
I can't hear the audio.
Okay, thank you. We tried the audio before and it sort of was working, but I think there's a few things that can go wrong there. So the audio there would be an audio playing with each effect. So lots of different effects, all switch driven. Some get quite a bit more complicated. See, we've got images there. We press the switch and the image is revealed. So opportunities to explore. Build It. So Build It's quite a new app. And I ran the whilst we were all coming in, I ran the jellyfish app, which is nice and calming. And there's another interesting touch app, although it can be used with Switch and other devices as well, called Just Touch 2. And this is quite. It's got some buttons as well to control this. So and with some screen interaction, I can get it's following the mouse, or it would follow the finger, or follow a pointer. So this is just a beautiful visual app, really, visual interactive app that responds to touch.
Would be particularly interesting in a snoozeland type room, I think.
Yeah, makes sense. So that's a sample of a few of the apps. I'll go on to show more later on. But I just wanted to explain how we hit a bit of a challenge really around 2017, 2018, because we'd produced quite a few apps for iPads, but of course schools themselves had a whole mix of computers. There was lots of Chromebooks in America. There was many Windows computers still everywhere and still being invested in as they were a low-cost computer. There were Android tablets popping up, and of course there were still the Apple Macs growing in popularity in line with the iPhone, and naturally the iPads being adopted everywhere, often in combination with Chromebooks or computers being in that same school or school district or area. So it gave every assistive software developer a challenge, really. It's how can we make the same piece of software, the same app, work as close as possible on every platform? Because up until that point, to develop things for iPad, well, even now, to develop things for iPad, you had to do them in a certain way and then do them in a different way for Chromebook and a different way again for Windows. So it was quite costly and quite technically challenging. But we noticed a popularity of what was called web apps. The web technology was developing, and we sort of worked towards what we saw as universal apps, and we dived into converting many of the apps into these web apps. And this meant everybody's used a web app without possibly without knowing it day to day. Maybe your gym sort of booking app or Netflix. They're often Twitter, I think, even are what are called web apps or progressive web apps. And so we changed every app now into to have a web app version, so that a web app will run when any device contains a browser, and it will also run live in the cloud, and it will also run offline when needed. So if we go back to the Splatter app, this actually was running directly in the cloud. So I press this launch button here, and you'll see we've got this running directly in the cloud, but it still behaves as if it were an app. It looks just the same on iPad. But we have another possibility to install these where we can, where I can just go to I can just switch across to load this directly from the server, and then in Chrome there's a little button here that says install the app. So I'm going to install the app onto my device, and you can see now that it's a full screen app. It's got, because it's in Chrome, it has a couple of extra things up here which are helpful. Now that works exactly the same in the Microsoft Edge browser, where you can install them, and it works the same on an iPad where you can run it and then save it to the desktop. And that app is saved directly onto the computer, so you don't need the internet connection now. And so this gives us the same app and the same look and feel, but it allows us to quite quickly deploy them at low cost, as efficient as we can on all of these different devices. It's took a lot of work, and it's perhaps a little bit boring. Sorry, can everyone see my screen, or have I done something wrong there?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Thank you, Paul.
I think it's also worth pointing out that if you don't want to do it this way, you can just download the app from the App Store.
That's right.
And
the links here.
That's
right. I've put the links in there, so we're still able to build those cloud apps quickly and put them in the App Store or the Google Play Store. So it allows an IT administrator, if they always use the App Store, the iOS App Store, and they're just bothered about iPads, or they've just got Google Chromebooks, then they can get it from the App Store, or it can be run directly from, in this case, our Sensory Live website. And so you could log in and run them, or we even license them out so they can sit within large school districts web servers. So they're sort of just for students that have logged in. So it gives, it's a little bit technical, so apologize about that, about kind of how it can work. But I'm just making the point of how these assistive educational apps can be more easily deployed across many devices, and then to the remote devices, and then to helping with remote learning. So it can easily get to parents, it can easily get to the devices of the students and the learners, and they work remotely in the way that I've demonstrated to you. Obviously the sound's missing some, it should work, but it normally does work, but we all know what audio is like at a distance. Now, as I mentioned earlier, with the iPad apps that we created, all of those were switch accessible, even though the iPad itself didn't, in the early days, support too much switch access. It's got better and better, so switch access is much easier for working with an iPad. But there was a challenge about which devices are people are able to use on which computers. It slightly varies. There was some uncertainty, perhaps. Mixes of devices might work on an iPad, but are more problematic on a Windows device if it doesn't have Bluetooth and things like that. All the apps are working with keyboard driven inputs, so 1, 2, 3, 4 space and enter tends to operate all the apps, and the arrow keys where necessary. But we noticed something called the Xbox Adaptive Controller in 2018 at a conference, at a couple of conferences. I'm holding it up again. Hopefully you can see that. Can you see that, Paul? Paul? Anybody?
Yes, I can see it. However, I generally turn the audio off. My audio, so I'm not interrupting.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So that's the Xbox controller that we saw, and it was for an Xbox, obviously for an Xbox gaming device. So we thought, oh, it's quite interesting, and it's got 2 switches built into it. It's got a thumbnail here, a thumb controller, and it's got a lot of holes in the back for connecting existing switches and existing access devices, as long as they've got a standard connector here. And if we compare it with a regular Xbox game controller, each one of these inputs maps to a certain control on the regular hand controller. So if a game responds to A, B, X, and Y, or just a regular game, not necessarily a sensory app or anything, just a regular game responds, you can plug them into A, B, X and Y, the switches, and you've got it working. Now this can connect to a Windows machine we found in 2019. So I thought this is good. And it also connected to a Chromebook by Bluetooth. And then in 2020, I think, it was supported by the iPad and iPhone. So we found this, this device is about £75, I think, when we bought this. It's got 2 switches inbuilt, and it's basically working and connecting to all types of main devices. So is this the first universal access device available? Not sure, could be. I'll just run the video for you though. I can hear some music, but if you can't hear the music, it's something Microsoft put together. Obviously there are packs of switches from that will work from any supplier, and Logitech recently put together a switch pack as well. That's a low-cost switch pack for about $150.
I think it's worth reiterating, while there's no noise, that the Xbox controller does seem to work on every device we've tried, whether it's a Chromebook, an iPad, an iPhone, or a Windows machine.
Yeah, it seems to. And to be clear, we're not being paid by Microsoft to promote this piece of hardware. We just genuinely discovered it a few years ago at a charity centre, didn't we? A disability gaming charity centre. So it seems to be work pretty well. So it put in our head around COVID time, when there was lockdown, we thought, well, you know, should we be treating every one of the sensory apps effectively as a game? It's an activity. Each thing is a sort of a specific activity or resource or a tool. And we made a decision, and Paul worked out all the details so that we added support for the Xbox controller into pretty much every sensory app house app. So if you run an app from the cloud, or if you download it onto the iPad or onto a Chromebook, then using a standard Xbox controller or the Microsoft Adaptive Controller, that would control the app. And of course, both of those devices are wireless, so you can have it on a big screen. And if you need to operate it or want to operate it in a sensory room type of situation. So we've got quite an unusual situation, I think, where we've got over 70 apps now with support for this Microsoft input sort of method. And we also found, although we didn't roll many out yet, we also found we could put the apps onto the Xbox controller itself and load them into the Xbox as if they were a game. So we'll get around to doing more of that. But if we just look at a few more of the games and why this it might be relevant, we created a series of Switch-driven simple games. So if we look at Switch Flip first, and Switch Flip is a Switch-operated game. It doesn't really have many inputs, and what you do is you hold the space bar or the Switch. And there's some noises appearing in my ear whenever I succeed or fail. So I find it quite challenging, but as you work your way through it, your bouncing gets higher and your score improves, and it's a nice accessible challenge. We also then Paul also then did an adaptation of the famous pong game, one of the early computer games. So with a Switch, I'm using my spacebar at the moment. I can play.
And of course, you can change
Nice,
things
tense
like
game.
the speed, or actually how the Switch activates, whether it moves while the Switch is held down, whether it's 1 or 2 switch, etc., to give some flexibility.
Yeah, the speed, the size of the puck, and the size of the paddle, and things like that. So that's that rolled out a good few months ago. And there are some other ones, some of which are free, some of which are paid for, and we're going to build those up as well in time. This is when we're able to combine with speech or with voice input. We're able to create a game for speech therapy, perhaps. And we've got a few of these coming through now. So this is a nice car. If I press the switch, it will actually go up the hill. All fine. However, it's also responding to voice. So if I make a sound, it will start driving.
And you can actually make the application responsive to different volumes of sound or different pitch, or even, it's a bit experimental, but whether it responds to certain fricative sounds. So we could set it so it would respond to a or a. I think that's really down to the speech therapist to explore.
So we've got a stick game like that, which you've got. So it's combining speech as well as switch input. And finally, this is a little bit of a step in a slightly different direction, but the sort of an early build app, of which there'll be more, called Alpha Drop, is again switch driven, but it involves some letters. There's a nice sound when it lands, and so I'm just pressing the switch, the letter will drop down, and perhaps the letter or the letters can be sounded out, talked about, and things like that. And so we intend to do a good number more of simple activities and apps for maybe phonics and searching and word recognition. Okay, I've done 26 minutes, so I've run over by 4 minutes, so I apologize, but I wonder if we have any questions. I'm done, actually. This link will go to everybody, of course. I can put that in the chat. Well, actually, no, I think that'll be sent to everybody, and I'll switch back to the video, perhaps. Please bear with me. Are there any questions?
There was a question in the chat, Dave, about using the Xbox controller with visually impaired students. And I think, Paul, you had replied to say it kind of depends on the application that you're using that Xbox controller with.
Indeed. I mean, you could just as easily ask, if I'm a bit flippant, you know, could you use the space bar with a visually impaired user? Well, it depends what you're trying to do and what game you're trying to do or activity you're trying to do with them. I think in terms of low vision, people with poor but some vision, a lot of the apps are intended to be sensory stimulating, particularly in a visual sense, and so could be used in a white or probably with a VI user, a black room, snoozling room. And there, the Xbox controller could be one of the devices that the person could use to interact with, something like Electra, which is what Dave started with.
Yeah,
but it really depends on the application.
But if I just run up an application that's maybe in that area that you're referring to, Paul, let me just quickly switch and share my screen again. So if we look at this app, which happens to be Psychedelic Mesmo, it has four buttons on the bottom and some other actions. So all of those would respond to the Xbox controller, the adaptive controller, and other switches. And so there are quite a number of strong visual apps in the range. So that's probably not the best example, but it's along the lines of, I think, what Paul was referring to.
And it's a good way to test if any of your pupils are epileptic.
Sorry about that.
Thanks, Dave. I can really imagine that one just looking fantastic in a dark room or a snoozling room, you know, and giving the control to someone. Really, really powerful. That's super. Thanks ever so much for that kind of overview of all of the many apps that you have. Really good to know that it almost doesn't matter what device you're using, you can get it on your device, whether it's an actual download the app from an app store or just run it from the web browser. And I'm sure that will be really useful information for folk as well. And just great to know that as well, if you've got one of those Xbox adaptive controllers, you can kind of get it working with all of those. So it's always good to see those other kind of access methods as well. So listen, thank you very much.
If anyone has any tech questions around that, any specific questions, just send us an email anytime, please do.
That's fine.
And there will be a login, and Stephanie asked, so yeah, there will be a login distributed to everybody, so everyone can have a 6-month login.
That's great, and that information is going to go out with the link to the recording of this webinar, so everyone who's here today and anyone who's not here but signed up will be able to access that as well, I believe. Listen, thank you very much, Dave, and thank you, Paul, as well, for being here, and just really good to hear what's happening. Lots is happening with Sensory App House. Thanks to you all as well for coming along today. We're back in another 2 weeks' time with more of an AAC focused webinar. We've got a couple of folk from Dundee, speech and language therapists, who are going to be talking about voice banking. So should be a good one as well. So please do come along, and we'll hopefully see you there then. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.